Okay. Okay, we have today Theresa Grafenstine with us. She is the Inspector General in the United States House of the Representatives. He was in 2010, the Honorable Theresa Grafenstine was named the Inspector General of the United States House of Representatives. Currently, she is the Vice President of ISACA International, and she has been nominated to be the next chairwoman, the President of the ISACA International. She will talk about account to arms in internal audit's role in the ongoing cyber war. At this moment, I will give the word to Teresa to start her meeting. Thanks, Teresa, to be with us today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is very exciting for me, and the wonders of technology that I can reach out and connect with ISACA members across the Atlantic Ocean. So this is very exciting. When Valencia asked me to do a presentation and I was coming up with the title, I was thinking about I'm a person who, I was a child of the 80s, so I grew up in the 1980s while we were in the middle of a Cold War. And so one of the things about that was that we all understood what that meant, that there was the Soviet Union and the United States, and being an American kid, you kind of knew who the different players were in that. And I think what we're in right now, if we fast forward 10 years, we're going to look back to this period and realize we were in the middle of a Cold War, but it's a cyber Cold War. It's sort of the beginning of it. And I don't think we fully understand that. And the thing is, I think that audit has a considerably large role to play here, although it may not be quite obvious to all auditors. So that's sort of the point of this talk. So the areas I want to go over today is risk-based auditing. What is that? I want to set the case and make the case for the growing cyber threat. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk about what auditors can do. What role can we play? And before I do that, the icon on the right of your screen, it's Inspector Clouseau. I take for granted that a lot of people know what an Inspector General does. That's what I do every day. I've been in the Inspector General world for 25 years. But then most people have never, ever met an Inspector General. And a lot of times you might think of Inspector Clouseau, the bumbling detective back in the 1970s or 1980s of French films. But what an Inspector General does is we're very much like, we're similar to internal audit in that we look at controls. We oversee financial statement audits. I'm a risk advisor. I'm heavy, involved in cybersecurity. We look at payroll functions. We do all the things that internal auditing would traditionally do. I think one of the things that differentiates us, though, from a classic internal audit shop is that we also handle criminal investigations. And so sometimes that's part of what we do as well. So we need to have an understanding of the law and criminal statutes. But I just wanted to give you my perspective so you know where I'm coming from. So if you look at all internal audit, all auditing standards, whether you're external auditor, private practice, public practice, that sort of thing, they all assume that we're basing our audit programs and our audit plans based on risk. And in a recent survey by KPMG, they went out and they surveyed audit committees, and 80% of audit committees want audit to extend beyond traditional financial reporting and controls. They want us to provide more assurance on the escalating IT risks. And the thing is they see audit as trusted advisors, and they very much want our skills and our reliability and our independence to extend beyond our traditional role of looking at finance. In an Institute of Internal Audit survey that they conducted back in 2014, so it's a little dated, but I think that these things are timeless, and I'll show you the progression. But in a survey of audit committees and boards of directors, they surveyed them and they said, what should audit be focusing on to provide the most value to your organizations? And it's incredible that how in alignment that they are. So the audit committee and the board of directors agreed that the #1 priority for internal audit should be strategic business risks. After that, operational, compliance, regulatory, IT, and the only place that they differ is in their number 5 priority, which is risk management effectiveness and cost expense reduction. But that actually makes sense because an audit committee would be looking at risk, right? And the boards of directors are going to be focused on, the bottom line, cost reduction. But other than that, they're in complete alignment. So you must say to yourself, well, audit, if everybody else agrees as to what audit should be doing, then audit is probably in agreement as well. It's kind of like, we're singing songs, we're all friends, and we're completely in agreement. Not so much. So when they audited it, when they went out and surveyed chief audit executives, what they found out is that they're in complete misalignment with what the audit committee and the boards of directors want internal audit to focus on. And in fact, it's so much out of alignment. If you look at internal audits, top priority, it's operational, and after that's compliance, regulatory. But what I thought was striking to me was their number 3 of where they spend most of their time, they categorize as other. And to me, it's like, what is other? Other is so sort of generic. I joke with people and say, is other like we're sharpening our pencils? Are we out buying green ledger paper? What are we doing with our 3rd highest priority of our time is in an area which we can't even quantify. But what's even more striking than that is that nowhere on that list is listed strategic business risks. Nowhere on internal audit's list is that listed. So you may say, well, Terry, that was in 2014. So obviously, by 2015, things must have been getting better, right? But unfortunately, in the 2015 IIA Pulse of the Profession survey, they found that only 23% of chief audit executives conduct continuous risk assessments. And so when I flip that over on its head, that means that 77% are not doing risk, they're not evaluating risk on a continuous basis. And even worse, only 16% said that they have an audit plan process that's flexible enough to respond to emerging risks immediately. And in that, they actually called out on the survey. They said, if a competitor had a major cyber breach, would you be able to change your approach? And they said, no, they couldn't. So when you take those two things together, the fact that they're not doing continuous risk assessments and they don't have an agile enough planning process, in the realm of cyber, things change in a moment. They don't change in an annual reporting process or cycle. A lot of the traditional older audit shops, they want to look at audit plans and they want to do that on an annual basis. In an age of cyber, that's incredibly risky. So you say, okay, well, that was 2015. Surely we're getting better at looking at emerging risks. Unfortunately, we are getting a little bit better. 69% of chief audit executives acknowledge that they need to be communicating cyber risks to the board. But even though 69% realize that this is incredibly important, only 40% are doing that. 63% said that they need to provide more resources to really evaluate and assess that cyber risk, yet only 26% are actually doing it. And so the picture that I have for this particular slide, I put on there, it's a crocodile. And you may wonder why I did that. So through my travels with ISACA, being on the board of directors and as the incoming international chair, I've had the opportunity to interact with chapters from all over the world. And one of the chapters I was able to recently visit was in Brisbane in Australia. And so while we were visiting with in the Gold Coast in Brisbane, they took us to a wildlife preserve run by Steve the crocodile hunter. And so most of the animals there had been captured by him before his untimely death. And as an American going there and seeing a crocodile for the first time, they had a zookeeper there, and the zookeeper was feeding the crocodile. And he was very, very quiet about it, and he was telling us how crocodiles live. And so the crocodile, even though he was 17 feet long, which is incredibly large, saltwater croc, was swimming around, and his eye was just barely visible skimming along the surface of a very, very still pool of water. And so as the zookeeper started tapping the ground, he explained to us that in the wild, crocodiles wait for an animal, large animal, to get close enough to the water source to kind of bend down and drink. And then just when they're there, they leap. So to me, cybersecurity is very much like that crocodile in that you know it's there. It's skimming along around the surface. You see it in the news every day. But when it comes down and leaps out and gets you, it's too late. It's too late to react. It's this massive, huge problem under the surface of the water. We need to make sure that we're being proactive so that way it doesn't leap out and catch us off guard. So this is another analogy I like to use. I like to say, are we suffering from compliance myopia? So myopia, myopia means sort of nearsightedness or very narrowly looking at things. And so I always tell my staff, there's the risk of the checklist. And what do I mean by that? So a checklist is something that in auditor land, we very much love our checklist. And even in my personal life, I love my checklist. It helps me to keep on track of things. And one of my little quirky personality traits is that when I do something and it wasn't on my personal to-do list or checklist, I'll actually add it to the list and then go and strike it off because I want credit for having done, that particular task. And it makes me feel good. The unfortunate thing with checklists, though, is that if we don't understand why a particular item is on the list, what's the underlying risk of performing that audit activity, we can start kind of going through that list mindlessly. And that's incredibly risky. When you think about, in the U.S., we had a housing crisis, like the 2008 timeframe. And when you think about mortgages, which is, how we buy our homes, they're incredibly regulated. So you have internal audit looking at mortgages, you have external audit, you have regulators, and you have to ask yourself, how in the world could such a regulated product how did all of those regulators and auditors all miss the fact that we were going to have this massive crisis in the mortgage industry? Well, I would propose to you that part of it was over-reliance on checklists. So if you're looking at a checklist and it says, is the form complete? Check, yes, fantastic. We did that we did that step. If you look at the next thing and say, did they sign the form, and so on and so forth. The unfortunate thing was that the checklist did not say, is this a tragically flawed loan product that's going to bring our entire economy to its knees? Nobody asked that strategic business risk question. And that goes to the earlier slide where we talk about, is audit looking at strategic business risks? And unfortunately, we're not. And the mortgage crisis is a testament to that. So this is another analogy. Risks ahead of you are closer than they appear. One of the things that I strongly believe about audit is that we need to become more proactive. In traditional audits, it's very much about decisions that have already been made and transactions that have already been processed. And audit I've been in the audit profession for my entire adulthood, 25 years since graduating, and I see that as incredibly important. However, if we're constantly, it's like driving a car. If we're constantly looking at the risks and only focusing on risks that have already occurred, things that have already happened, if we drove our cars that way, we would eventually hit somebody, kill somebody, hit a tree, or kill ourselves. And audit is very similar. We need to make sure that we're looking at the risks that are out ahead of us, being proactive. And that sometimes means that we may not fully understand what we're looking at because we don't have a crystal ball. But that's absolutely where we're going to provide our most value. So next, I want to talk about the growing cyber threat. So in the U.S., the GAO is the Government Accountability Office. That's where the Comptroller General is for the United States. And so they do audits across the entire government. And so they put together, back in 2014, unfortunately I wasn't able to get more recent stats, but they put together a report that talked about the amount of reported incidents of actual threats and attacks against federal systems and federal agencies within the U.S. And keep in mind that not all attacks are reported. Some they try to remediate on their own. So this is just the ones that they know about. So in 2006, they had only 5,500, which is a lot, but 5,500. You fast forward to 2014, and we have over 67,000 reported breaches in U.S. federal systems. That's an incredible growth path, and it's not going to change. One of the other challenges that we have as auditors, a lot of times when we talk to the board or we talk to our organization, they look at cyber controls as overhead, and it's very difficult to argue for something that to invest money in something that you're avoiding a cost. It's a lot easier to have something tangible. So this was an interesting study conducted by the Ponemon Institute where they actually looked at the cost of cybercrime. And as you'll see, I think that this arms auditors with data that says this is something that is incredibly costly if we actually have a breach. So if you look at some of these numbers, depending on if it's a minimum type of invasive breach up to a maximum one, it can range between $307,000 to clean up after an incident all the way up to $65 million. That's incredible when you're thinking about all the money spent there. And sometimes people focus on a breach. They look at it very, very narrowly in terms of PII, personally identifiable information, because that's what naturally comes to mind. So when you have a breach, you're going to think about the people whose identity or information has been compromised, and part of the cost with that is that you have to go out and you have to purchase them identity theft protection. And granted, that is part of the expense that you're going to incur in cleaning up after a breach, but it goes much beyond that. And a lot of times I don't think we fully understand that. So for example, if you have a nation state type of breach or something that's incredibly invasive where they've installed backdoors, that may require you building entire infrastructure from scratch. So for example, rebuilding Active Directory or rebuilding all of the databases that you have. Because if you have a really sophisticated breach where somebody's gotten to your system and they're installing backdoors as quick as you're finding them, you can't rely on the integrity of your current system. And you have to start a completely new system that's not connected. And think about that, all the servers, all the infrastructure, all the licenses, everything, the man hours of porting over all of that information. I think once we understand what really bad looks like, it makes our argument to the board or to our audit committees a lot easier as to why we need to implement these preventative types of controls. So here's a list of some of the ones that impacted me. A lot of here are ones that impacted me personally of various breaches, but every day the list changes. Some of these are kind of old at this point. OPM, Office of Personnel Management, that's one that impacted me personally. So for those of you in Valencia you're not familiar with U.S. processes, what OPM does is they actually conduct all this security clearances for those of us with a security clearance. So I need a security clearance in order to access secret or classified information. So I have a top secret security clearance, and I've had one for 25 years. And so as part of that, they ask lots of questions. I have to fill out forms. I have to give my fingerprints. They do background investigations on me. They interview my neighbors. They talk to my friends. It's very, very invasive, the level of information that they collect about me. And I don't have a choice. I have to provide that information in order for me to have my job. And unfortunately, basic controls were not put into place to protect my information. And so me, along with 21 million other Americans who've undergone similar processes, our information was stolen by reported accounts by another nation. And the unfortunate thing about that is that not only do they have my Social Security number, which is sort of my national ID, different things that you can use to create credit accounts and steal my identity, they also have my fingerprints, which is a biometric piece of me. And so they've invaded my privacy at a level that's very difficult to explain. And when you think about it from a national security perspective, that also gives a nation, if they have ill intent, which they must because they went through the hassle of breaking into the system, that gives them the opportunity, because these are 21 million people with top secret security clearances, that gives them 21 million chances at trying to find somebody who could be embarrassed enough about the information in their record to convert them into a spy, which is very dangerous from a nation level. The Internal Revenue Service in the U.S., they're our tax authority, and they've had a series of breaches. The one that's listed on here is actually, this happened probably about a year ago, but there's actually been more recent ones. And the unfortunate one is, I like to joke with my chartered accountant or CPA types of friends, and there's something in the accounting industry that we call SOC reports, which is they're looking at controls over other entities who process your data. And since the IRS has had so many, Internal Revenue Services had these series of breaches, I said, wouldn't that be interesting if the American citizens demanded that the IRS provide them with a SOC report prior to filing their taxes? And what do they think that the IRS would actually do? I think we would be arrested for tax evasion. I don't think that will work. But the unfortunate thing is that while we're compelled to provide this data, they're not putting in cyber controls in place. If you Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, that's one of the largest processors of medical claims within the U.S. And even though I don't have a contract with Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield, If I've ever used my insurance, Anthem is behind the scenes paying, processing the claims. So that's another one of 80 million people that I was part of that breach. And my children were part of that breach. And my children's identity was compromised as well. And the other one, Stony Brook, I'll get into that a little bit later. But to kind of give you a sense that this is things that impact us beyond just credit cards. A lot of times people think about cyber breaches as only a credit card, which that's part of it. But a credit card is something where people have become so desensitized to it, they think, well, it's not that big of a deal. They'll just send me a new credit card and they'll close out my old account and I'm not held responsible. But I gave the other examples to show that it impacts almost every aspect of our lives. So who are the types of cyber threat actors? So this is a slide that ISACA put together, and I think it's very interesting. It talks about sort of the capability for damage versus the ability to protect. And so they have terrorists listed a little bit lower, which I actually would say that they're actually acquiring a lot more cyber skills. So I would actually put them up a little bit higher now. So terrorists, there was an incident a while back in the U.S., probably, I think it's about 2 years ago at this point, where they were able to breach a state police officer's database, and they actually put data out on the internet for their ring of terrorists and encouraged them to go out and take physical harm against these police officers. I mean, so terrorists, they're a real threat. Hacktivist vigilantes. A lot of times people think, well, they'll never know about my company or my organization. That's not exactly how it works. So if your company has a relationship with a third party that these hacktivists don't like, or in our case, at the House of Representatives, if they're writing a bill that the hacktivists disagree with, you become a target. But with a private entity, if you have a relationship, or perhaps maybe you're selling a product that they disagree with, they go out to the dark web and they solicit support from other hacktivists, and they can orchestrate a denial of service on your entity with just very little coordination. It's not a whole lot of effort there, and they can be incredibly effective. Commercial enterprises. So this is sort of traditional commercial spying, where before it would require you to actually physically break into the headquarters of your competitor. But now they just need an internet connection to be able to go in and break into your organization's computer systems and steal your intellectual property. Cyber criminals, they're incredibly more getting sophisticated. They're the ones who go out and they steal massive amounts of credit card data or healthcare data, and then they sell it on the dark web. Nation states, this is where it gets very, very difficult to protect because they are very sophisticated and they're very motivated, and they can create lots and lots of damage. And that's where I'm going to focus on the next couple of slides. So in a U.S. Defense Science Board report, they define Tier 1 vulnerabilities. So what are those? So a Tier 1 known vulnerability would be the types of things that your antivirus software already knows about and recognizes the signature and has already put it into their antivirus software. It also would be if you get a Microsoft update or a Java update, they're updating it because they found a known vulnerability and they're patching it. So that's what a patch is. So a Tier 2, and this is where a lot of our time is spent talking about in the industry, is unknown vulnerabilities or zero-day exploits. Everybody wrings their hands over zero-day exploits and what does zero-day exploit mean? It's sort of a mystery if you've never dealt with them, because it sounds like a very technical term. All that means is that nobody knew about the vulnerability until the day that it was exploited. So they have 0 days to react. It's thrown out into the wild before anybody has written a patch for it. And Tier 3, the last one, is adversary-created vulnerabilities or advanced persistent threat. So let's talk about that for a little bit. So advanced persistent threat, it's an adversary that possesses significant levels of expertise and resources. These guys are really dedicated. It's entire nations where they have people that this is what they do for a living. They want to be able to create multiple attack vectors, be able to get in. They're going to use cyber methods, but they're also going to use traditional spying methods. They want to be able to get into your IT infrastructure so that way they can establish a foothold so that they can steal your information, exfiltration. And they can undermine your ability to do critical aspects of say, critical infrastructure, whether it's water processing or electricity, the electrical grid. And they want to be able to embed themselves in there so they can continue to do this. This is a really growing threat. So how does the advanced persistent lifecycle work? It very much mirrors a traditional spying lifecycle. So what they do is they initially go and they do intelligence gathering. So what does that mean? So if they've targeted your organization, what they would do is they would figure out who works there, and they would come up with an organization chart. So who's the chief executive officer, who's the president or the partner. They're going to go all the way down to who's the payroll clerk. And a lot of times, it's not just the chief executive officer or the very famous people that they're targeting. A lot of times, they're actually targeting people at sort of the clerk level, the very low entry level. And you may think, well, why would they do that? Well, let's take the example of a payroll clerk. A payroll clerk, is probably going to be, introductory type of level. They're not going to think that they're ever on the radar. Their defenses are going to be a little bit lower because they're not going to realize that they're a target. But more importantly, they have access to payroll data. So if you want to steal things, where do you go? You're going to go to somebody who's handling the finances, who's doing data entry. And when you think about the way that a lot of our systems are set up for ease and convenience, most people will have, at the local level, they'll have local system administrator control of their laptop or of their PC. Sometimes even worse than that, the system administrator will have given a clerk a lot more ability to impact the underlying database, to actually get into things. They may have administrative control over really important and critical systems because it makes it a lot easier for them to access. It's a bad security decision, but sometimes people do those decisions. They make those decisions because it's easy. So if you get into, so how's the initial exploitation work? What they'll do is, once they've done their intelligence gathering and they know how, they may look at your LinkedIn profile, they may go out to Facebook, they may look at Twitter, they're going to look at Instagram, all the social media things that people put out in the public that you can gather information about somebody. Once they know what clubs you belong to, who your friends are, they'll craft an email. They'll spoof the email address so it looks like it's coming from somebody that you know. And this is nation-state level, advanced persistent threats. So this is something that's well-crafted, well-designed, and targeted. So they'll craft an email, and the email will have a link, and maybe the link is going to a club that you belong to, or at least you think that's what it's going to. It may be talking about a cause that's very important to you, and it's coming from somebody that you think that you know, because it's a spoofed email address. And so what happens is that the person clicks the link because they're not suspicious, and they click the link. And from there, what happens is that malware is installed, and you get into rootkit, and then they establish a connection, and they start beaconing out to a foreign IP address, and then that's where the magic begins, where they start downloading things and getting command and control. So once they get into your system, they realize they want to figure out what privileges do you actually have. So to my earlier example about the payroll clerk, they may have set up that system so that she has or he has local administrative control over their physical laptop or their PC. And so from there, okay, what can I do from there? Do I have any shared accounts with anybody else? Does that payroll clerk, as our example, does that payroll clerk have administrative access or rights to PeopleSoft or SAP or whatever system that you're using? And the whole point is that you want to go in and do privilege escalation, whether it's through a shared account with somebody else that through another account you start hopping from one point to the next, and that's called lateraling across the network. So eventually you're going to be able to get in there, find a weak account, maybe do a password spray where you're putting in weak passwords against known usernames, and you're able to it's fairly easy to do, but once you go and you do that, you're going to get an account. Once you get in there, you do privilege escalation, and you do data exfiltration. So typically with data exfiltration, if they're very good, they're going to do it, we call it slow and low, meaning that they want to do it, they don't want to clang all the alarms. They don't want to do it so in bulk fashion, lots of big pieces of data that it's going to set off alarms and somebody's going to notice. They're going to do it really slow. They're in it for the long run. They're very patient. So they're going to do it very slow, small amounts of data over a long period of time. And they're going to push that out into Dropbox. They're going to push it out into a Gmail account or whatever, but they're going to push it out outside of your network. So in an ISACA survey, 92% of survey respondents said that advanced persistent threats pose a credible threat to national security, economic stability. 1 in 5 said that they've experienced an advanced persistent attack, and 66% say that they think they're going to experience an attack. So this is something that we understand. It's on our radar that this is a big deal. We need to pay attention. We used to like to say security through obscurity is not a strategy. This was a report, this pie chart is one that was put out by the Industrial Control Systems CERT. And so they look at attacks on U.S. industrial control systems. And so when you look at the types of things that are part of industrial control systems, it spans, even if you don't own these systems, if you're a citizen, these are things that impact your day-to-day life. So whether it's our food supply, they had 2 documented attacks in the first quarter of 2015. Water supply, 14 documented attacks. Chemical companies, commercial facilities, nuclear, 6 attacks. And while that may seem low, even if one of those is successful, where they weren't stopped, imagine that, how that would impact life. The thing is, though, is that we're kind of going into largely uncharted territory. And so by uncharted, I mean that we don't really know how this works. These are just newspaper articles where they talk about different nations. We're in a cyber policy arms race, or another nation has said that out loud and in the press that they have the ability to destroy the U.S. power grid. These are all things that should make us worry, just as citizens, let alone as cybersecurity and audit professionals. But the thing is that as we're going into this murky area, you have to ask yourself, what actually constitutes an act of cyber war? What does that mean? Traditionally, when we're talking about actual war with tanks and with soldiers and all that, we all kind of understand what war looks like, and we have well-defined processes for that. So when in last year's election cycle, there was concerns that potentially there was people, other nations that might have been meddling with the voting systems, and that's a charge that's in the press right now with European countries as well. Is that an act of war? The thing is that nobody has really defined that. Nobody really knows what the threshold is. When is it okay to declare war? Nobody has that answer yet. So when you think about the old rules of war, they don't apply. I'm definitely a history buff. I love reading history books. I have long commutes in every day into Washington, D.C., usually about an hour and a half drive. And so I spend my time in the car. Instead of listening to music or the news, a lot of times I listen to audiobooks on history. And so I like to hear about World War II and various presidents and world leaders. And so when you think about the Geneva Convention, that's a convention that all these nations signed on to 70 years ago. And the thing is with the Geneva Convention, it defines for everybody what's a war crime. What are the things that are legal in war? Because some things are not legal in war. So, for example, if you're in a declared war and you have a pilot who's flying and they're a person that the enemy shoots them down, that's legal because you're in a war. However, if the pilot's jumping out of the airplane and you shoot him as he's trying to parachute down, that's not legal. That would be a war crime. If you're caught, they would take you to trial for that. The thing is that we don't have those same types of defined thresholds for the cyber realm. And that makes it risky for everybody because nobody knows where the lines are. So think about that in the era of the Internet of Things. So there's, I have up there a picture of a resort. And this actually happened where it was a ransomware attack on this particular resort. And what happened is that because there's such a growing heavy reliance on computer systems within the hotel industry, we don't use physical keys anymore. We use card keys, and we swipe in to get into our rooms. Well, with this particular ransomware attack, they actually locked all the guests out of their rooms. And so the hotel had no option but to pay the ransomware if they wanted to continue running their business and let the guests back in or out of their rooms. Think about medical devices. There's so many, this particular news article was about insulin pumps, but there's so many things that have become attached to the internet. So, for example, ISACA's CEO has a daughter who has a medical condition that requires her to actually sync up with her doctor using the internet to provide him good data. Now, from a healthcare perspective, that's fantastic. They're able to get real live data on a real-time basis so that they can provide stellar medical care. But imagine if a ransomware attack were carried out against that type of medical device, an insulin pump or any other type of medical device. Think about the attack that happened in October 2016, where using people's DVRs and webcams and baby monitors, because those things were designed not for security, but just designed for just ease of access. Well, you had a whole host of attackers, hackers, that use those as bots, a big, massive botnet, and they used it to take down a portion of the internet. Again, with Jeep, so with the Jeeps, they showed that you could use, because again, that's connected, it's an Internet of Things. It's not just picking on Jeep either, because this is these types of systems exist on most modern cars today. But this particular example was on that vehicle, and they were able to take command and control over the vehicle and cause it to break. But imagine if they can cause it to break, that means that they also can probably cause it to speed up, and you could potentially kill somebody that way. So this is so the San Francisco ISACA chapter had this as their advertisement to advertise one of their events, and I just loved it. So I use it. I just love it, and hopefully the San Fran chapter sees that as me advertising for them, because I think that they did a great job. But I think that when we hear about all these growing threats, this is how we feel, or sometimes we just want to think, should we just give up? I mean, this is incredibly overwhelming. So this is a great cartoon that I saw. So security or insecurity starts with you. So in this corner, we have firewalls, encryption, antivirus software, etc. And in this corner, we have Dave, human error Dave. And a lot of times, people focus so much on the very technical aspects of cybersecurity, and yet one of the biggest attack vectors starts with the people, human error. So let's talk about that. I like to say cybersecurity is a garden of mostly low-hanging fruit, where if we focus on the things that cause us sort of the most cyber threat, it turns out that they're not particularly technical. And so when I talk to audiences, ISACA audiences tend to be very technical, but there are other audiences who aren't as technical. And so I say to them, don't be overwhelmed by this. Let's focus on the things that you can have the biggest impact on right away without buying a lot of tools, cyber tools. So phishing. So when you think about phishing in U.S. federal government space, 91% of all major hacks have started with a phishing email. And in private industry, the stat I think was in the 60s, 63%-ish, that range. But the point is that that's not technical. That gets into educating people. Don't click the link. If they don't click the link, they can't establish a foothold. And the thing is that while a lot of people, we look at, the old, the phishing scams where it talks about a foreign bank account and click this link and your old dead lost aunt wants to give you $2 million from another country that you've never even visited. They're easy to spot, right? We know that that's a scam. It's fraudulent. But some of these phishing attempts have gotten very, very good. So we need to become sophisticated users. So, for example, the Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield one that I have up as an icon, that was very timely because they knew that 80 million Americans have been impacted by that hack. And yet hackers sent out a fraudulent version of the email to a bunch of people. And they knew that 80 million people, so if the U.S. has, 350 million, 370 million citizens, 80 million of which were impacted, if they sent out a massive email, chances are they were gonna connect with people who were part of that breach. And so that increases their chances of having somebody click the link. We need to be sophisticated. Don't click the links. And that doesn't require, whether it's in your organization or your personal home life, that does not require a lot of fancy tools, expensive, cyber tools. That's just education. And these are stats from a Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. If you've never read a Verizon's Data Breach Investigative report, it's fantastic. It's fantastically written. They use a lot of humor through it. So people who think that security professionals and cyber professionals can't be funny, they really need to take a look at these breach reports that Verizon puts out. but they're incredibly informative in that they show where a lot of the breaches are coming from, what are the exploits that they're using. But the one stat that I brought out for here is, because this is not technical, I'm pointing out the two things that are not technical. They said that over 99.9% of exploits occurred more than 1 year after the vulnerability was identified. So think about that. So much time and attention is spent in the news and in our industry talking about zero-day exploits, yet when people actually were hacked, if they were using a system that wasn't patched, the vulnerability that wasn't patched had been known for over a year. The system just had not been patched. So this is not technical. We need to make sure that we're patching. So if I'm an auditor and I'm new into the IT field, the two things I would want to know are, is my IT department patching things, and what is our training and awareness program for phishing? So with anything else, so in the audit field, when major pieces of legislation came out or major vulnerabilities, and even like in the straight finance area, when different, like in the U.S. we had Dodd-Frank or Sarbanes-Oxley, and they were incredibly complicated pieces of legislation that required audit and accounting to get involved. And yet we were able to get our minds around that and understand what we had to do. This is no different. We just need to develop our plan of attack. So for example, we need to come up with a relevant cyber framework and pick one. And once you look at it, read it, understand it. This is for that. And so for the first year or two, what we did is that we built into our contracts the requirement that the contractors would have to train the staff. So every time they would perform a step, they would the staff would perform the same step, but they would do it in a sandbox and a protected offline environment. But it gave them the ability to actually do the actual cyber types of steps, and they were able to create that expertise. And guess what? At this point, I use very, very little, no offense to my contractor friends out there, but I use very little contractor sources, which I use my own staff to do most of our very technical IT types of projects. The last thing is ask questions, and I'll get into specific questions that you should ask about, financial institutions. Think about the risk there, and that's a guidance, and so it's the controls, and so we need to go through information. I didn't start it, but when you look at sort of the track record of the accounting industry in getting ahead of various cyber risks, it's incredible. So if you go back to 1974, when you think about that, we didn't even call IT back then. We called it EDP, right? I mean, it wasn't enterprise data processing. So we didn't even call it IT then, and most people hadn't even seen a computer in person. And yet the accounting industry was looking at ways that auditors could provide assurance on IT controls. Fast forward, I'm not going to go through all these, but fast forward to Web Trust in 1997. So in 1997, a lot of us were just figuring out what the internet was. A lot of things that we take for granted now, like Amazon or eBay and some of these other, Walmart, all these massive online presences that provide, e-commerce, they didn't even exist back then, or maybe if they did, they just weren't very well known. And yet the accounting industry, auditing industry, were looking at ways that auditors could provide assurance on the controls over those transactions. And so fast forward again to 2011 when we created the SOC reports. So if all else fails, and as you're getting into this, and I think what you do is you need to make sure you do what auditors do best, which is ask questions. I always like to say is that if you've been an auditor for a long time, I've been an auditor now for 25 years, and I have an ability to read people's body language. I can understand, whether or not maybe they're not being fully truthful or not. And I like to tell my teenage daughter that's to her detriment, because I can read what she's thinking. Maybe not completely the way she thinks, but I like to tell her that, and it's been convincing so far. But as auditors, we do have the ability to read people and to understand if they're being fully honest with us. So ask questions. And so, for example, if you ask the question, do you have executive board support for your cyber program? And if the person says, oh, of course we do, cyber is very important, the way that you would, even if you don't understand cyber, the way you would do that from a financial perspective is that I would go back and I would look to see whether or not The board has approved, or executive management has approved funding for the appropriate level people? Do we have processes documented in place? And do you actually have technology? Do you have a firewall? Do you have like the real basics? You don't have to be technical to ask those questions. And if they don't have those types of things, then chances are they're not actually providing the support that it needs, and that would be an audit finding. So, for example, if your IT department consists of one guy stuck in a closet somewhere, chances are you're not investing a lot in IT security. Critical systems identified, and this is again a basic question. Hey, have you identified all the systems that if you had a major breach, that this would be a big deal? A lot of times, you'd be surprised, a lot of IT departments can't provide you that information, and they'd have to do some work to figure it out. They're not going to have it on a ready-made list. And so if they don't know all their critical systems, because there's this big problem of they call it shadow IT, where you have users that have created little databases and other little pockets of data that are critical, that they use them every single day, but the IT department doesn't know about them. So that's also a risk. So if they don't have a list ready-made, how can they protect those things? Say you have a denial of service attack, how do you know, or say you have a breach or malware, something that starts taking things down, how do you know what systems need to be brought back up? So another question is is it connected to other systems? So so we come up with the list of all the critical systems that we have. Do we have any business-to-business types of relationships? Is it connected to outside parties? Are internal department computers connected to other internal department computers? What do those connections look like? What protections are in place? If it's with an outside organization, do we have agreements in place that if there's a breach, what if they have a breach? Do they notify us? Who's responsible for remediation? Another question I would ask is, who relies on the data? And the reason why you'd want to know that is different stakeholders are different levels of priority. So if you don't know who's relying on data and a system's been compromised, you don't know which areas you need to put back up quicker. So if you're in the healthcare space and you have doctors who are relying on data to do a surgery that day, because there's different very, very technical processes that they use. They use computers now to do surgeries like LASIK and other types of surgeries. That would be something that's very important to know, because you'd want to put that system back online first. Who has access to the data? You'd want to know that too, because do you have too many people? So if I'm an auditor and I don't have a lot of technical skills, if the IT department person, I ask who has access to all this data, if they can't give me a list and they can't explain why different people have access to that data, that's a problem. You need to make sure that as few people have access to it as possible. The only people who absolutely need to do it as part of their job responsibilities. Do they have audit logs? Are they maintained and reviewed? A lot of times organizations don't enable audit logging, and so that's bad, because if you have an incident, how are you going to recreate what happened? And then conversely, if you have an audit log and they're running those, does anybody ever actually look at them? Because if you're waiting 6 months to go back and look at an audit log, well, I don't know how useful that's going to be to say that you were breached 6 months ago. It's something that you should be doing routinely. Cyber response practice, you should ask that question. It's one thing to have it written on paper. Hopefully they have that. Where's your plan? But it's one thing to have it written on paper, but if you haven't practiced it, it's kind of like a fire drill. If people are first time figuring out how to get out of the building on the day of a fire or an emergency, people make bad decisions. People get afraid, and they do things. When people are operating from a position of fear, they make bad decisions. You need to make sure that they're practiced and comfortable in doing what they need to do, and they know what their role is. Do you have support contracts in place? So that's also important. So say you have to go to an alternate facility. Do you already have that contract in place? Do you have vendors where you can immediately go to and get replacement laptops or servers, and so on and so forth? So you don't have to be technical to ask these types of questions. So cybersecurity, what's our role at the House of Representatives? So we are very, very active. We try to be, and it's more about working together as a team to make sure that this is a big problem. It's a big threat, and we all need to be in it together to make sure that we're looking for every possible angle so that way we're protecting our organizations. So the types of things that we do is we do white hat hacking. And so what does that mean is that we actually take on the role of a hacker, but we're not going to deface servers. We're not going to install actual malware and that sort of thing. But I think it's incredibly important to replicate as best as possible what an actual hack looks like. So and a long time ago when we first started doing this, we would the rules that were in place were we would have to let the Chief Information Security Officer know, okay, we're gonna do a white hat hacking exercise and we're going to do it next week. Well, guess what? That does not reflect reality, because the security professionals are going to be looking for our activity, and so they're going to immediately catch you. So you want to make sure that if your organization is doing white hat hacking, that it's mature in the sense that you can do a general announcement and say within the next 3 to 6 months or a year or whatever, we're going to be doing this exercise. And so that way you're not, one of the things you'd want to be careful about is that you'd want them to know the general time frame, like 3, 6 months, whatever. So that way, if there's an actual incident, they can call you up and make sure it's not you before they escalate things and start taking things offline. So that's sort of a safeguard you want to have in place. But you need to have these types of exercises reflect as close to reality as possible. The other thing is that you want to do phishing. So if phishing represents it's the largest attack vector for hackers to get into your systems and have a foothold, you'd want to make sure that you're doing phishing exercises. Obviously, so we've done that at the House, but obviously not with the intent to install malware, but it was to increase awareness. So that way when people clicked on links, they would understand, wow, if this had been an actual phishing exercise, if a bad person had actually sent me this email and I had clicked the link, they would have installed malware and I would have put my organization at risk. And so we do those types of things. The other thing is that we're constantly making sure that we're keeping up to date on emerging threats and trends, and we've actually gone through and looked at their policies and plans, and we provided them real-time feedback, so that way they're as prepared as possible. We also do training and outreach, and we do video outreach and that sort of thing to update people in using terms that they understand. I think you can be very smart about cyber or very smart about any topic, but if you can translate it into terms that your audience understands, so across your organization, then you're missing an opportunity to really, really educate them, because they want to be part of the team. They want to be part of the solution. So that kind of comes to my last slide, which is cybersecurity. It's a team sport. So I say it's not just about government setting rules and policies. It's not about industry coming up with all the tools and management coming up with all the controls that are in place. And it's not about audit coming in and testing those controls. You need all three parts to actually have a holistic approach to cybersecurity. This is a big problem. This is something that we need all of those skill sets to be able to effectively address it. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention. And here's my contact information. And for my ISACA members out there, I'm incredibly honored to becoming your incoming chairman of the board starting in June, and I hope to get to meet you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was really nice to listen your news about the auditor role. I don't know if someone is listening and has a question for Teresa. Jose Antonio wrote about the new rules. NATO recently adopted the cyberspace as the 5th domain to protect. It was something that was talked also in one of the ISACA meetings. Do you have something to say about that, Teresa?
I'm sorry, about which one in one of the meetings? I had put my speaker closer. I apologize.
No, Antonio says that NATO, NATO recently adopted the cyberspace as the 5th domain to protect.
The 5 domains to protect. I'm not as familiar with that, so I would be. That's not one that I would want to comment on.
Okay. Some other question? No, more or less we are on time. just 1 hour, you, Teresa, talking about this interesting point. I think it will be really interesting for all the members of ISACA. We will try to share also with other chapters in the region. And thanks again for your presentation, and congratulations for your nomination as chairman of ISACA International. I think it will be really, really nice to see you in the next month.
Thank you very much.
Then I think that there are no more questions, and it's on time. Only to say you again, thanks a lot. And we will let you know any questions that we receive about your presentation by email. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.